Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Jeff Stiles and this is another video by EpiraConsulting. Today we're going to be taking a look at item coverage codes. These are the different essential strategies that we use with master planning in order to determine our planned supply and demand orders. Now bear in mind today we're going to be using a local instance of D365. That means it's all running just on my laptop, so I don't have access to planning optimization. Planning optimization, if you don't know, is Microsoft's improved way of running MRP. It's fantastic. Everybody loves it. Has some quirks to it, but essentially the substantive way that you're using planning in D365 doesn't necessarily change. It's much more of a background effect that has minor tweaks here and there. But what I'm going to be showing you today is by and large what you would see with planning optimization. Now, another thing to bear in mind also is that we'll be going over the priority coverage code and the DDMRP's decoupling point coverage code as well. Those need planning optimization in order to be executed, but what we can do today is go over the setup and what that would look like in theory after they're run. Everything else though, we're going to be doing by hand, click by click, so you can actually see what the heck this looks like in D365 instead of just looking at another Microsoft Learn document and using your imagination to fill in the pieces. Okay, so let's get started by reviewing, hey, what are the coverage codes? Where can we set those up on a specific item? And then what are some of the background supporting pieces of information that we're using along with this scenario today in the form of the BOM, the route, and the sales order and where that's created. So let's jump into it. Here at the front, we can see master planning. This is the workspace that we're going to be using today. I've already run it, but we'll be jumping into here in a minute. Let's jump over now though to the item coverage codes. And we can do that by going to our released products. Okay. Here we have our released product details page. Our components, our raw materials for today, are going to be paper, ink, and glue, with the finished good being this P1004 book. Essentially, we're just creating a book. All right, in the simplest way possible, we have the paper, the ink, and the glue. If you wanted to get to the released products page, as always, just come down to product information management, close all these up, products, released products. Okay. Now, there is much more configuration that goes on with planning, but today, like I said, we're just focusing on the coverage codes themselves. This video is for people who, they have a bit of experience with master planning, but they've never actually fleshed out and seen all the different strategies you can use with it. So with that in mind, I'm not going to be going over the master plan and coverage group associated with this item. Instead, let's focus more on that item coverage page. So in the action pane, go to plan, item coverage. Okay. And this is an example of what we're going to see once we jump into the item coverage page. We're going to see the overview tab where we see a minimum, maximum, and a coverage group associated with a specific storage dimension. Here we have a site and warehouse, site A, warehouse 1, and site B, warehouse 2. You'll notice there's a minimum here on site A. That's can be used a few different ways, but essentially what we're saying here is for site A, warehouse 1, we want at least 100 quantity of this item, paper, in stock at all times. Coming over to general, we can see quite a lot of different fields, but specifically I want to be focusing on this coverage code drop down here. Now this is going to be the override coverage group settings section. That means I can determine the coverage group here, which is coming in by default, also chosen here. And what is chosen here automatically is coming from the released product itself. But I can also take that coverage code that's on the coverage group and determine it to be something else. And this is where we get into the different coverage codes that we're going to be using today. So we have period, requirement, min-max, manual, priority, and decoupling point. Priority and decoupling point, those last two, are the ones that I mentioned earlier that we're not going to see executed today, but we're going to be able to see the setup and get an idea of what it's going to look like when we're using planning optimization. Period, requirement, min, max, and manual, those can be run with the legacy version. So we're going to actually see those executed today. All right. For our purposes, I recommend the simplest way to start stepping into planning in D365 is to use the requirement coverage code. It's the most intuitive. It's essentially just saying, hey, when we have demand, create supply. That's all there is to it. That means once we get in that sales order, 10 units for our book finished good, create a production order for 10 units of that book finished good. That's it. And then everything else that's associated with creating that book finished good, such as the raw materials that today are coming from purchase orders. So creating planned purchase orders and a planned production order in order to satisfy the demand coming from that sales order. That's what the requirement's doing. It's also, this isn't talked about enough, it's also looking at that minimum field right here. So in a sense, it's kind of like min-max, but not the max part of min-max. It's going to be looking at the minimum field and making sure that we at least have stock that meets that minimum also. Okay, so it's not just looking at demand and creating supply off of strictly based demand orders. It's also going to make sure to create any planned orders to maintain our minimum stock quantity. And today, we're not going to be using lead times on those purchase orders in order to keep this relatively simple. And we don't have stock. We don't have any stock on these items right now either. Okay, so that's a little bit about the coverage code we're going to be using today. Let's jump over now to the BOM and route, because those are going to make a lot more sense later on as we're looking at the Gantt chart. Okay, so how do we check out our activated BOM and route? Well, go ahead and select your finished good item. And this is kind of a quicker way of doing it. There is a list page that you can check out for the BOM and the route. But if you want to see specifically a BOM and route that is already sorted to the item that you have selected here, this is the best way to do it. So come up and select that item. Then in the action pane, engineer, BOM versions. Okay. And here we can see the different versions on the left-hand side here at our quick glance bar. What we have available for our P1004 finished good book. Okay. Not getting into this too much, but I just want to show you the different components that we're working with and their quantities, because we're going to be seeing these quantities used by planning. We have our P1001, O2, and O3 per series, one across the board, 5, 2, and 3 quantities. Okay. I also want to point out right down here, and this is in the line details fast tab, general tab, the operation number being associated with this item. This is telling the system, hey, I plan on consuming this paper raw material on operation 10 of the route that is active for this finished good. I also have that set up operation 20 for ink raw material and operation 30 for the glue raw material. Okay, so that gives us an idea of the different components we're going to be using in our finished good that will be calculated as part of MRP. Let's check out now our route. So we have a better idea of the times that MRP is going to be using. So here, like with the BOM, we're starting off with the different versions that we have available. We have 2 available here. I want to select this route right here. And then come up to our action pane, route details. We can see the operations on this page here, similar to how we can see the components at the version page of our BOM, but it doesn't give us all the detail that I like. And to be honest, I like the layout of the route details page a bit more, because we can see the operations, more or less their header level information, and then their line level information down here. So as you can see, we're starting off with operation number 10, cutting that paper, and then moving on to operation 20, printing, and then operation 30, gluing. We can see the resources available on each of these: our cut resource, our print resource, and our glue resource. These are all machines with calendars associated with them. The calendar being something that is going to also definitely come into play when it comes to planning. If we have a specific calendar, for example, associated with a resource that is blocked out on a certain day, we can do that. We can have one resource that is not available on Fridays. Maybe that's maintenance day for that resource. And then planning will take that into consideration. But this is what I really want to point out today. Our queue times, our setup, our run, our transit time, and our queue time after. This is a big part of what's going to be impacting our Gantt chart. So for example, on our first operation here, we have the queue time before, so our wait time before, and then our setup time, and then our run time. These are all in hours, and we know they're in hours because our hours per time here is set to 1. Our process quantity here is also set to 1. And so we can imagine that our our run time is going to scale with our process quantity. Our queue time and our setup time, as well as queue time after, are all going to be constants. One other tidbit here that I want to point out is the formula section on our setup tab. This is how we're going to be essentially consuming. Here we can see it's currently set to capacity. Capacity is going to take into consideration the capacity value that we set on the resource. And the capacity value is telling the system, hey, I can, based on this resource's ability, I can process X amount of units per hour. Okay. If we want to use standard, then we're going to be telling the system to look at the runtime and calculate runtime based on the process quantity. And so when we're using that capacity consumption, we're telling MRP to use the capacity value on the resource. And when we're using the standard consumption, we're going to be telling the system to look at the runtime. And this is something I'll go into more depth later on when it comes to the production side after we do planning, which is going to be in a future video. But essentially right now, if you want to keep it simple and just have your runtime used, then use that standard consumption. We have capacity here as well. We want that to be standard. And we have standard already chosen here on our glue operation. Okay, but similar to our first operation, we have a little bit of setup here on the second operation. We have a little longer of a runtime, or a little less of a runtime, but we also have queue time after, so that's another constant we'll be seeing on our Gantt chart, and a setup constant, a queue time constant, and a runtime right there. Okay. The idea behind the queue time after here is I'm essentially saying, hey, the glue is going to have to dry, and maybe that takes about 5 hours. Okay. All right. So that covers our BOM and our route. Let's now take a look real quick at the sales order that's going to be driving some of the demand we're looking at today. All right. And to get to our sales order, there's always a couple of ways to do it depending on the modules that you have access to. If you're just someone who has access to accounts receivable, we can go to orders, all sales orders, or we can come down to sales and marketing. Again, sales orders, all sales orders. There's a lot of different ways to get to the same page at D365. So when you see something like this, just know that these are not all unique links to these different pages. There's oftentimes at least 5 different ways to get to a lot of different pages. So a lot of these links here are essentially repetition in different places. Okay. So we have our sales orders available to us. We have 2 current open orders right now. I think one of these doesn't even have a line on it. So let's jump into this one. Okay. And this is the order we're going to be working with. We can see the customer full price books. It's a competitor to that common half price bookstore. And the item number P1004. We know the name. It's our book finished good. And we have a sales order of 10 quantity here. All right. Also, we have a requested ship date. This sales order was made previously. I'm going to update this to today. so that we can help out master planning a little bit more and create this scenario that, hey, this was an order that was put in today. The customer wants it right away. We're not going to have anything in stock in order to satisfy this sales order though. So we're going to see MRP help us out a little bit in order to notify us that, hey, we're not going to be able to get this out on the requested receipt, on the requested ship date to make that requested receipt date. Okay. All right. But all we have to do in order to trigger this demand into our planning engine is hit save, which is just asking us to update those dates on at the line level that we just made at the header level. Okay. Awesome. And that's it. MRP now knows that this is demand in the system. Okay. So finally, let's jump into our planning engine and see what we can do here. So again, we have master planning at our workspace. We can access this workspace at any time by using this giant list, or we can come down to the actual master planning module, workspaces, master planning. Okay. And so a little bit about this before we get started. The workspace for master planning is very useful. Each workspace is essentially combining in shortcut form and with different filters, various other pages that people just often use in a particular process in D365. You'll notice though, at the bottom in this links section, we have links to the full individual pages that this page is often pulling together. So for example, if we wanted to see more about an item requirement, we could do that. If we wanted to see more about the master planning parameters that are being pulled into this page or the coverage group being pulled into this page, we can go directly to that page as well. If we want to see more about the different orders, the planned orders that are created here, we can select this See More button, just hiding down there a little bit, and go to the planned orders page. The workspaces are great. I like them. They're a great communication tool. At the same time, though, they don't always have all the functionality that you might find on the separate list pages. And so up here at the top, we can actually see a lot more information, a lot more clicks, a lot more functionality that we're not going to necessarily see on our workspace. But for our purposes right now, the workspace is pretty good. So let's go ahead and run this. So I'm running it with my master plan. My planning method is regeneration, meaning that I want to wipe everything that's out there currently and create everything else anew. So let's go ahead and select OK here. All right. So there's not much going on in the system right now. And so that was pretty quick. But you can imagine with the master planning engine that used to be quite long in production environments, but with planning optimization, it can be about that fast, or 30 seconds. Okay, so remember to refresh this page after it runs using that little circle at the top right. Okay, and so now that's updated for us. I like to sort my items here, Z to A, just for my numbering sequence so that I can see the finished good at the top. But remember, we're using that requirement coverage code right now. And so we know that we have a sales order of 10. That's why we're seeing that 10 requirement quantity right there. And we're also seeing our raw materials. Now we have two planned purchase orders for each of our raw material components. Why? Well, before, as I mentioned, we have a minimum value associated with our different raw material components. We have no stock in the system right now. And so we're not only getting planned purchase orders for that minimum safety stock, essentially replenishment, but we also have planned orders for the specific sales order that is driving our production of the planned production order. Okay. And so that's where those are coming in here. For our sake of ease of communication, all of our minimum stocks are going to be at 100. All right. Coming over here to the right, we can see a delay days column. Okay, now why are we getting that? Well, we know that we're planning with finite capacity. Finite capacity, again, this is something I can get into a little bit more on the production side in our next video, but finite capacity is telling MRP, hey, I don't want to schedule any of these resources that I'm using here that we saw on our route. I don't want to schedule any of those resources to operate at the same time. All right. Because I have finite capacity turned on for each of those resources. If I had finite capacity turned off, I could initiate each of those resources to start at the same time. Sometimes that makes sense and sometimes it doesn't though, right? And so here I don't. That's adding to the delay that I have in being able to finish this production order. The other delay that's being incorporated here isn't lead time, because once again, to keep this simple, I turned off all lead times, all safety margins. The other component here that's developing that delay is the runtime. Okay, remember, runtime is scaling with our process quantity. Our process quantity is coming from our demand. Our demand is that 10 unit on the sales order line. Okay, we have an order date column here. This is the system telling us, hey, if you want to get this thing done, you need to order it by this day. You need to firm, you need to come up here and select firm and actually get this started on this particular day. And what it's saying is, hey, today's 6/19, you need to get this started on 6/19 today. However, we can also see 6/25, 6/24, and 6/19. Why is that? Well, MRP is pretty smart and knows that we don't need these different raw materials all at the same time. We just need it when it starts on the particular operation that it's associated with that we saw at the BOM. Remember, at the bottom right of our BOM page, we have that little operation number screen. Now, as we're going through our Gantt chart, we're going to see how those line up. But essentially, we don't want to be holding on to that raw material while we don't need it. And so because we don't have any lead time here on those purchase orders, the system's telling us to order on the day when we're going to be using the raw material on the operation. Okay. Scrolling to the right here, we can see that delivery time, 6/19 is our order date. Our delivery date is 6/27 for that production order. As I said, we don't have lead times on the planned purchase orders. We also see, again, a requirement date. Requirement dates are often the same as our request date, okay? But the requirement date can also factor in lead times. We have a status column here, which I'm going to come back to in a second. And we also have various other requirement times available to us as well. Okay. All right. So again, let's take a look at our Gantt chart and see how this status field is going to be impacting us. So selecting our planned production order, we can come up to View, Gantt chart. Okay, and so here's what we have right now. We have two different views set up for us real quick. Up at the top left, we can see this production order based on our resource view or our order view. We currently have order views selected, and so that's why we can see the order right here. Okay, that planned production order, and then all of the different operations associated with it, the resource associated with each operation, the start time and end time. And let me build this out here so that's a little easier to see. Okay, we also have our day and our times of starting these different operations. Now we can see a lot more with each of these by going to Setup, Content. We can show more content for production, show more content for our planned production section for planned production orders. And essentially what it's going to be asking us is, hey, what kind of jobs do you want to see? What sort of information about those jobs do you want to see? Do you want to see material availability and similar jobs and material availability for any existing production orders? And the general section here, we can load in our working calendar, which is going to highlight different days when we have an open schedule for work. We can also show those links and show any late jobs as well. I'm not trying to overpower us today, so I haven't turned on everything. These little icons here are material availability. And you'll notice that, hey, it looks like the first set of raw materials, the paper, is set up for arriving when we need them on Operation 10, but not so on Operation 20 or 30. And I'm going to show you how to fix that here. So if you select Operation 20, we can see the different operations associated with it. This is the first job on Operation 20, and we should be seeing that material availability icon right here when we're starting. Okay. But before we go ahead and fix that, I just want to make another call out on the resource view. Okay. We can hit expand all at the top. And from the resource view section, we're seeing the same information, but instead broken up not by the order view, but instead by the resources themselves. Okay. And so here we can see the resource, that order, and then the job, and the operation, excuse me, and then the different jobs associated with that operation. All right. And scrolling to the right here, we can see we have a lot of cutting time, and then we're linking over to our print setup, then the print process, the print queue after, and then coming over to our glue, all those stages there until we're done. I like the order view because it's just a little simpler, but it's up to you. We also have our setup views section where we can see a lot more information depending on what we want. We can factor into here on this left bar, site, order, production unit, resource group, resource, operation, and so on. If any of these are unfamiliar to you, stick around for our next video where we're going to be going into these, where they're set up and why you might need to pull those into here. And again, we have our views available to us for the resource view. These are independent, but as you can see, they're almost exactly the same. Okay. So this gives us a good idea of what's going to be occurring when, as we're producing this planned production order, but we need better planning on these different purchase orders. So how do we tell MRP that that's going to happen? Essentially what MRP is doing right now is it's using a delayed date in order to calculate those different planned purchase orders. And it also just, it doesn't have the executable information in it right now because essentially we haven't told master planning that, hey, we really want these planned production orders to occur. And after we tell it we really want these to occur, then it's going to factor in those planned production orders into a more realistic timeline. And so the way we can communicate that to master planning is by approving them. Okay. You can also do it if you firm, but if you don't want to go ahead and firm, you just need to approve them. There's a couple of different ways of approving. We can do so on our, again, coming down here to see more. We can do so by selecting approve right here on the planned orders page, or, which is a little easier, you can come here to the status field if you have the privilege available on your user to do this and change from unprocessed to approved. Okay. So I'm just going to change the planned purchase orders that are going towards my planned production order to approved. I like to save, go back, and then you need to run MRP again. What's the purpose of approving? Well, when we approve any of our planned orders, it's essentially not going to be written over when we run a regeneration. And so that's a way to keep information that we want to hold on to when we run planning. And so as you can see, we have done a regenerative master planning run, but the status is still at approved on these orders here. That means MRP knows we want these. We want these to be used. And so coming again to our planned production order, we can go to view, Gantt chart. Oh, okay. So now we don't see these material availability icons all strewn out here randomly. We can see them. Yes, it's set up correctly for our first operation here. We can see 10, 10, 10. That's our first operation and the jobs associated with it. And the material availability icon, we're getting those right on time. So we're not wasting any energy storing those. And then coming over, we can just select the sidebar here in order to jump right to that job. We can see the material availability is now coming right on time for that operation 20, and operation 30 coming right on time for operation 30 as well. Perfect. Okay. If we had any safety margins in here for receipt, we might see these coming a little earlier. Okay, but we don't right now, and so they're just coming right on time. Awesome. So again, this is a really handy dandy way of being able to sketch out and project what your planning engine is planning for you. So now that we've seen a little bit about how our requirement coverage code is generating our planned orders, I just want to speak for a minute about what's the point of this. Well, we might be using our requirement coverage code, for example, if we have critical items with intermittent demand. This is a very important item that we want to have traceability on between its demand and the supply connection through our pegging or marking system, but it's not something that occurs often, that we have to regularly keep stock up for. We also can use this for make to order items as well. Okay. Now that we have our planned orders, let's jump into one of them now and see a little bit more about what the planned order actually looks like. We can do so by selecting the number here. Okay. And so up at the top in our general fast tab, there's a few key details to point out. Of course, we see our item information, but we also have that requirement date. Requirement date for a planned production order is going to be when we actually want to have the thing done. We can also see the delivery date here. We don't have a lead time on that. Planning priority is going to be factored in when we actually use the priority coverage code. So right now it's just set to 0. We have that start time again, which is that order date that we mentioned before when we need to get this thing kicked off, and the end time, which is factoring in our case, our runtime, our finite capacity, our setups, all our other job times, okay, and our plan that we used. The status is unprocessed. Remember, as before, we can change this to approved, completed, or unprocessed. If it's completed, we're just telling the system, hey, we already used this, it's okay. All right. We also have the pegging information. This is that link. As I mentioned before, it can be very useful to use requirement coverage code when we need to directly keep traceability between what is creating the demand and what has created this planned supply order in the form of a planned production order. Here we can see it's that sales order that we saw before for a requirement quantity of 10. If we needed to click into that sales order, we could do so by clicking right there. All right. Coming down here though, we can see the delays fast tab. And this is where the system is telling us, hey, this isn't going to work. You've essentially put in the order for a requested date of receipt for today, 6/19. So that's the desired date. But we know because of the setup on the production order and the resource and the routes that we're only going to be able to get this done by 6/27. So we have that calculated delay of 8 days. It's really just using our calendar and going from 6/19 to 6/27 and giving us those days there. 6/19, 6/27. Okay. Now, on this page as well, we can select explosion in order to see a bit more about this planned order. And I think this is particularly useful if you want to see all of the other associations with this planned production order. And so up at the top here in the overview, we can see a breakdown, not dissimilar to what we might see in the BOM designer. And so up at the top, we can see a lot of shorthand information, but essentially that we're working with our finished good and then our raw material requirements, but also the planned order associated with each of them. We then have them nicely sorted for us here according to level. Like with a lot of logic in D365, the lowest number in a level is of highest priority, or in this case, the parent level. So if we do have a lot of subcomponents on this BOM, we might see another planned production order at level 1, and then several other planned purchase orders below that at level 2. Okay. We also have pegging information here for each of the lines that we select up here. So for example, again, we see our peg from the planned production order to the sales order, but we also see a peg of BOM line to our planned production order on this purchase order line. Okay. So again, we have the demand coming from the BOM line and the supply coming from the planned purchase order. So we can see that link out here. Part number 1002, part number 1003. Okay. And the requirement quantity associated with it. And so if you're planning, and let's say, for example, you run this in your production environment, most likely you're seeing tons of different lines. You sort it how you need it in order to see your priority, your urgency. And then you want to know, okay, well, which planned orders are associated with this finished good that I need to get done. I have hundreds of lines here, maybe thousands. Which one belongs to it? Then you come up here to that view, and then you can click explosion right away. Jump into it. Oh, okay. So that's all these are all the different planned orders associated with it, right? We can then jump into just the planned orders page itself for these particularly associated planned orders for the production order we previously selected. And so again, we're seeing our planned production order and its associated purchase orders below it here, but we have a lot more functionality available to us. We can now firm all, we can approve as needed, and dip into our planned order action pane as well as our view action pane. We can jump back to that Gantt chart. We can do whatever we need to. And so at this point then, we can come through here and firm as needed. And when it comes to firming, a lot of people don't talk about marking enough. It's critical, it's only one field, but it really changes a lot. When it comes to the difference between pegging and marking, remember that when you peg, it's more of a looser association that can change whenever you run MRP or your planning optimization engine, depending on the configurations that you have. And it's going to be that loose relationship that we've seen previously between your demand and supply orders. Marking is a much harder reservation of the items associated with each of those planned orders. And we'll be able to see what that looks like later on and how to undo it if it is a problem. It is, I would say by design, harder to undo, because what we're saying here is when we mark items from demand to supply, we're telling the system, don't use these items for anything else, okay? Because once we firm this order, we don't want anything else messing up this firmed order. And so you have to be careful with what you're marking. But let's take a look at it. So we have our planned purchase order. Let's say we want to turn this into a real purchase order. Let's come up to firm in our action pane. And we see the field update marking. Now we have a few different options here, and I've prepared a little bit of a speech for each of them. So let's go through them one by one. So no, why would you use this? Well, as you can imagine, no marking is going to be placed between the fulfillment and supply orders. Why is that necessary? Well, when fulfillment orders are generic and you don't need them to be tied to specific demand, this is a great option because it's leaving you open to future changes. Depending on your production, you might need to have a lot of flexibility, and this might be a good option for some items. Standard is going to be fulfillment orders that are only marked to requirement orders. It's going to make fulfillment orders only marked to requirement orders if the quantities on both orders match. Okay. For example, if a generated production order is created to produce 50 units, but its pegged sales order only requires 10 units, then only the sales order will have reference information. Okay? Because remember, we have 10 units associated to a supply order, to that fulfillment order in form of a planned production order. We might want to allocate those out somewhere else. Okay, so we have reference information on the sales order, but not on the entire planned production order. This is great for reserving that supply to its intended demand when you want to leave any supply quantity not needed to fulfill that specific demand open to any other type of demand. So again, it's another step away from flexibility, but still keeping some. Now, extended, this one right here, it'll be the fulfillment and requirement orders marked to each other regardless of their quantities. So a good reason to use this is to use extended when your fulfillment orders can only be used by your demand order. Okay, let me say that again. When your fulfillment order can only be used by your demand order. For example, maybe it's a critical or high value item that will have more demand in the future, so you can keep your supply marked to your demand to make sure that same supply isn't used elsewhere. This is also really great for traceability as well, as you can imagine. Single level standard. This marks only the parent level item on a fulfillment order to a requirement order. That means BOM components for the fulfillment order will not be marked to their production order. This allows MRP to be rerun when demand changes and allows for those same components to be used more efficiently since they're not locked down by marking. The standard side of the single level means that fulfillment and requirement orders will only both be marked to one another if their quantities match. Otherwise, only the requirement order will have marking. So why would you need this? Well, it's perfect for demand that you expect to have last minute changes. All right. So if BOM components aren't marked to the parent level finished good, you can firm your planned orders and later change the BOM components without having to unmark orders at that BOM component level. Right. And so single level extended, this one right here, still only marks fulfillment orders to requirement orders without marking BOM components, but will mark both orders regardless of their matching quantities. Okay. So those are the different reasons and descriptions of these different marking standards here. I've seen people use just about all of them. It's something to really sit down and talk about in order to determine what you need. For our purposes, just to make sure I see everything marked along the way, I'm going to choose extended. So we can select OK. And now that has turned into a purchase order. But where did it go exactly? Okay. So it just disappeared from here. Do I have to go all the way over to the purchase order page? No. Come up here to your View tab in the action pane, firming history. All right. So here we can see all of the different planned orders that we've firmed previously. And as you can imagine, this is just a lot of my own testing. The firming date, I've sorted by default, newest to oldest. It might not do this out of the box for you. Remember, if you want to make any changes to a column, you can just select it, hit apply, and then make sure to come up to your view page here and save as. So it's like that when you come back to this page. And here I can see that purchase order that I just firmed today, 6/19, for that quantity of 50. If I want to jump right into it, I can. Just select the number. When you firm, it's going to come into a real purchase order as approved. Why? Well, the idea is that you've already gone through an approval process for your firmed order. Remember, we can approve planned orders, and then you firmed it. So you're telling the system, I've already gone through any approval necessary. We're good to go when it comes to the purchase order. All right. So here we have the purchase order line. If we wanted to bring it in, we could go through our receipt process and then have that on hand. But real quick, let's go back and make sure to firm everything else. You can also just hit firm all here if you require, but that button scares me. Then we can hit firm. Now we have a few more options available to us because we have multiple planned orders available. A few that I want to call out are down here under purchase orders because these can be really handy. We can group all of these planned purchase orders either by vendor, by buyer group, or by planning priority. Again, this is an option that's going to be available to us if we're using that priority coverage code. We can also group by different periods, not at all, by a specific date, week, or month. Okay. For our purposes, I'll just have them grouped by vendor. Each of these has a separate vendor, so they'll probably just stay the same, separate orders anyways. Okay, so selecting OK on those, and they're good to go. This is a good call out here that I like to see, just to make mention of. It's saying that particular vendors are not authorized for these particular raw materials. This is just a configuration that you can have in the background. You can either allow this to be a warning or a hard stop on any purchase orders created when a vendor is not approved for a particular item. But today it's just a warning. Say okay. So again, let's come over to our firming history. And we can see those different purchase orders that have now been firmed along with that production order. All right. Now let's see the marking. We're not going to dig into these too much right now and firm these and receipt them in, but let's take a look at the marking associated with them. And we can do that a couple of different ways. One way we can do it is by going to the inventory management page. And so let's do so by going over to our modules, inventory management, close this up so it looks better, inquiries and reports, transactions. Okay. So here we can see the different transactions that have now been created. We have our production line here and our raw materials, those purchase orders, as well as that sales order and purchase orders associated with them. I think I called these purchase orders. Those are production lines, and we have our purchase orders right here. Okay, as well as handy dandy receipt and issue. So let's take a look at the marking that has now been associated with each of them. All right. It's worth noting again that if you're using extended marking, the production line transaction will become marked to the production order. Okay, production line to the production order when the associated fulfillment order for the production line is firmed. We've done that. For example, when the planned purchase order for the raw material is firmed, right? So this also changes the issue status from on order to reserved order, which is what we can see here right now. All right. So in order to remove the marking, let's jump into one of these. We can select purchase order, marking. We can see that we have a marked quantity marked at the header level, at this production line level, from the purchase order to the production line. If we want to change this marking, then we can select Set Mark Now. Once we select Set Mark Now, it allows us to change the amount of the quantity that is marked. So for example, I can change that to 25. It changes the remainder and the mark now quantity up there as well. But what happens if I change this to 50? Apply. Looks like the marked transaction disappeared. We also have a remainder in there. I select OK. Come back out here, I refresh the page. Interesting. Now it's on order. Okay. As mentioned before, unless it's marked, this is going to be just set to on order for issue. When it has been marked, we're making that reservation on the ordered amount. So it's been changed to reserved ordered. Makes sense. Okay. But that's one way to do it. The second way to remove marking is by actually going to the sales order itself or that demand source. So we have our sales order here. Let's select it. Okay. We can come over to our line details, our sales order lines, fast tab, and going to setup. We need to change our reservation here to manual. And we can get into those differences here in a later date. And then going to our inventory and marking. Okay. Again, we can see that marking set up, marked past tense. If we want to change the marking between the sales order and the production order, again, select set marking. By default, it's going to be undoing that marking for us. I select apply. It's gone. I have a remainder now of 10. Select OK. No longer marked. I can go back, refresh this page, and the sales order has now changed to on order as well. Okay, so that's how we would change that marking. And the reason why we would want to change that marking is if we made a mistake, but more importantly, if we need to switch out production lines or switch out fulfillment to a particular demand. It's a little cumbersome, but it's meant to be that way in order to solidify your plan so nothing else in the system automatically takes away, for example, a production line and associates it to another demand. All right. So awesome. We've gone through a lot on requirements. I'm not going to go through all of these different features and functions again for each of the different coverage codes. For the next coverage codes, we're going to be looking at specifically the outputs of them in terms of their planned orders, a little more detail. But when it comes to things like firming, marking, using the Gantt chart, exploding, looking at the planned orders associated, all of that's going to be the same for those different coverage codes. And so the output of planned orders is going to differ for the coverage codes. But when it comes to actually using those different produced planned orders, it's going to be the same. Okay. So let's jump over now. So here we are back at our item coverage page. Here we can see the coverage code, period, that's been chosen for our finished good as well as its raw material component items that we saw before. So what is period doing? Well, it's essentially aggregating all demand for an item in a specific period and then creates combined planned orders to summarize that fulfillment. And so one thing I've done is I've gone ahead and created another sales order with demand for our finished good. On 10/16 here, this sales order, we have demand for 10. And on this sales order here, we have demand for 5. Okay. Now, what's the point of using period? Well, we can use it for regular items that have somewhat fluctuating demand. For example, if they're especially raw materials used in multiple items, we don't necessarily care about having traceability for them between supply and demand because it's just not necessary to know where every little washer goes. When it's acceptable to reduce granularity for greater efficiency in planning, this is also an opportunity to use the period coverage code. It's something that was much more considerably used, let's say, when we're using the legacy MRP system due to performance planning. But now that we're using planning optimization, oftentimes that's not such a consideration, though it is important to just reduce the noise that your planning engine creates when possible. So that's another reason to use period. All right. So let's take a look at what this will do when we run our planning engine. So again, we're at the master planning workspace. Let's hit run. We're regenerating completely. I think we've already done a regeneration here. And so probably won't change. It says it's good to go. Always refresh. All right. And you'll notice that I have a big old delay here. And I don't have new planned production orders, one each for the 2 sales orders. And I don't have separate planned purchase orders for each of those different planned orders. What does that look like? Well, let's jump into this planned production order and see what it's pegged against. Okay. Here we can see those 2 sales orders that were created with their requirement quantities 10 and 5 respectively. Got it. So this planned production order is being used to fulfill these two sales orders. Awesome. We also have an increased delay of 15 days. That makes sense because we know that our runtime that we're using as part of our standard consumption on our resources scales with order quantity. Okay. Now we can dig down into this sales order here if we wanted, or we can use the explosion feature up top in the action pane. And we can see that more layered granular detail, which also just summarizes and does a great job at showing pegging easily between each of our associated orders here. So we have our planned order once again up at the top, level 0, with 10 plus 5 equals 15 requirement quantity. And then we have an associated planned purchase order. It's fulfilling this BOM line requirement for our particular planned order. How do we know it's for our particular planned order? Well, the number here on the BOM line, 1822, is the same line, 1822 here for our planned production order, and so on and so forth. Okay. What if we jump into one of these planned purchase orders? Okay. Coming down, we can see more of that BOM line information. All right. And once again, we're not using any lead time, so we're not seeing any calculated delays or anything like that going on here either. It is also worth pointing out that I do have a vendor set up by default for this purchase order. That's going to be important later on when we firm to have a vendor available for the system to generate that actual purchase order for. Okay. So let's jump all the way back to our workspace here. And we can click around on the side here. What do we have as far as delaying sales? Okay. Once again, because we have that delay, because we're asking for the order to be accomplished today, but the system's telling us, hey, it's not possible. We need at least 15 days. We're getting this delay here. So we know that, okay, looks like this planned production order is going to delay a sales order. We can always click into it, see those sales orders, have that conversation with the customer saying we're going to be late, or pass it off to one of our workmates in order to make sure that communication is made. Let's also check out the actions because something interesting might have happened. Remember, we already firmed a production order for this same finished good. The system's taking that into account. As you can see here, we essentially have a ton of stuff going on, but it's a lot less complicated than it seems. Let's sort by number, Z to A. We have our production orders up at the top here. All right, these are firmed here. We have our production line. It says cancel, 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 cancel. Oh boy, a lot of cancellations here for essentially the order that we previously firmed. Okay. And we have these BOM lines here saying advancing for the new production order that we just created, as well as increases here on these quantities. So what's going on here? Essentially, what planning is saying is, hey, you made that firmed order for the same finished good. You haven't even started it yet. Why don't you just cancel that one that you just created and then add on those requirements, add on that demand to the existing planned production and purchase orders? You're going to be even more efficient. So that's what it's recommending to us, and that's a pretty good idea. If we want to, we can select apply action up here at the top in order to make that action. For example, if we want to cancel. Okay, now that I've gone through and I've made the changes suggested by the actions, we can rerun. Okay. Check our actions. We don't have anything in there right now. We can still look at our calculated delays though, which is really handy because we can see that we do have that delay on those two sales orders and our planned production order. Okay. So that is what a period coverage code looks like. Let's jump on over now and see what min-max is all about. Now I'm using the coverage code on each of my components as well as my finished good of min-max. Using min-max, as you'll see, I no longer have the field coverage period enabled. It's disabled now. You can see period enabled, min-max, disabled. And I now have my maximum value available to me as well. So on many of these, I'm entering a minimum of 100 and a maximum of 400 or 500, hitting save. And essentially what I'm telling the system is, hey, if I have stock that goes below my minimum of 100, I want you to create whatever fulfillment order you need in order to get me back to a quantity of 500. Okay. What are the use cases here? Well, essentially we could be using the min-max coverage code for low value, high volume items with consistent demand, where we need traceability between supply and demand sometimes, but most likely it's not necessary. Also, overstocking is acceptable in these cases because the maximum value is not exactly dynamic, right? It's not looking at how many orders we have in the future. It's not dealing with forecasting. It's just a manual number that we have entered into here. And so these have to be for items that we're okay, probably having too much on hand at any given time. All right. So now let's turn over to our master planning workspace and see what it looks like. Let's run. And bear in mind that I still have those 2 sales orders in existence. So let's order these real quick to get a better view. Okay. So I have my requirement quantity for my make item, that's P1004 of 200. And then I have associated either minimum stock, safety stock replenishment, or an order to fulfill the safety stock of my make item. Because in order to fulfill my make item, my finished good, I need raw materials to be processed. Okay. So let's see, for example, this one would be a safety stock. I know I set that at 500. This would be safety stock. Here, I have 3 lines for item number P1001 because I have 2 safety stocks set up, one in site A and one in site B. And then I have another in site B in order to get the raw materials necessary in order to make 200, the safety stock requirement for my planned production order, the finished good. And we can dig into this to see what it looks like on the planned order page. And it's worth noting why the sales orders are listed here. So min-max indirectly tracks demand to the extent that demand reduces inventory for an item below its minimum quantity threshold. That's why sales order demand is included on the planned production order, as we can see here. But we don't have separate production orders for each sales order, like we would with the requirement coverage code. We're still going to see them pegged here to the extent that these sales orders are going to reduce this order, this item right there, below its minimum. And because this item is already at a 0 stock level, it's below its minimum, the system is correctly attributing the sales order demand towards being under the minimum threshold quantity for this item. Therefore, they're showing up as pegging. Okay. Here we can see the calculated delays. It's currently at 133 days to be delayed just because we have quite a lot more being required of this item than we did in our previous orders. Now looking at the explosion, we can again see that we have that planned production order. We have its associated purchase orders like usual. Okay. And the bottom line associated with those purchase orders and the pegging associated with that production order. Okay. And remember, we do have all of those decreases here, just the way it's set up currently. The action message, that's nothing to scare us. It's just not paying attention to the minimum order quantity. Instead, it's just looking at demand coming from the sales orders. And so in its mind, we don't need all of this on hand. Instead, we just need enough to fulfill those sales orders. All right, but essentially that's what the min-max is going to be doing. We can go ahead and firm these, make sure that we get the purchase orders created and fed into our planned production order. But besides that, let's move on and check out manual item coverage now. All right, so here I've switched all of our raw materials and our finished good to manual. Remember that manual isn't going to be doing a ton for us. It's going to exclude an item from the planning engine, so we can expect to not really see a lot of action here. But remember, the use cases for this are helpful. We can use the manual coverage code for obsolete items that we want to have in our system, but we don't want them being impacted by planning. We can also use items based on our human judgment. We don't have to use planning for everything, and maybe there's certain items that just need clear human discretion in order to fulfill supply and demand. But we can also use this code for items that we have in our inventory that are consignment, that are direct deliveries, or they're externally controlled in a different system. So let's take a look at what sort of orders or lack of orders we get. So I hit run, regenerate. Refresh the page, and nothing there. We just get this default line here with an order time already populated because this is our default. Okay, that's it for manual. Let's now jump over to priority and start tiptoeing into the DDMRP world. All right, so here we have our coverage code of priority on our make item. You'll notice that with priority, a lot of my fields here are disabled. For example, when I have manual set here, I have coverage time fence, negative days, positive days available to me. But with priority, a lot of that goes away because with priority, we're not focusing so much on demand as the driver of our planned orders. Instead, we're really focusing on hand consumption. Okay, so we have 3 values in order to help manage when to create those orders based on consumption. We have our minimum value, our reorder point, and our maximum point. And as you can imagine, maximum sits on top of the reorder point, and reorder point sits on top of the minimum. So let me go ahead here and just input some example values. What we're telling the system here is, hey, whenever we have our on-hand quantity go below the reorder point, we want to start creating a fulfillment order in order to bring it back up to the maximum. Depending on where that on-hand amount is in relationship to our maximum, reorder point, and minimum, we're going to tell the system what priority value to assign to the fulfillment order. So for example, if our on-hand quantity is just a few units below the reorder point, that's going to be a low priority. But if it's below the reorder point and the minimum value, where it's going to be a high priority point. And we determine all of that on the planning priority models page. So let's go over there now and take a look. We can do so by going to master planning, setup, planning priority models. And by the way, what are some of the reasons why we might want to use priority? Well, it's really great for items that have essentially frequent urgent orders or supply constraints. We really need that top-down view to point us in the direction of something that needs to be done right away. We also want to use the priority model if we need to prevent stockouts, okay, for critical items that don't necessarily need to follow chronological demand dates. We can also even use it for customers or orders that take precedence over others. Because imagine if you're using just a regular old requirement coverage code, and then for another item using the priority coverage code, that priority coverage coded item is going to really stand out much more on the planned orders page. Okay. But here we can see our planning priority models where we set up the method of calculating what is and isn't a high priority or low priority item. This is an example of one that I put together earlier. At the top here, we can see the name and description of this planning priority model, but we can also see the calculation method, the planned order creation, and whether or not to consider demand priority. Consider demand priority is linked to this tab down here. We can essentially, if we're creating manual sales orders, purchase orders, transfers, production orders, or demand, we can assign a default priority amount that feeds into our planning engine. Once again, when we're creating any of these manually. And so, for example, on a scale of 0 to 100, I can say that when I have a new manually entered sales order, I'm going to assign it a planning priority value of 40. Okay. And having this toggle turned on is telling the system, hey, consider that value coming from that sales order. But when it comes to this tab here, planning priority ranges, this is where we're setting up that relationship on a consumptive basis, on-hand basis, between that maximum, reorder, and minimum value. We know that we're using priority ranges because we've chosen it here in the planned order creation tab. We have a couple options. We can either split according to priority ranges, or we can create a single supply with most important priority. Okay. Let's talk about these for a minute. So split according to priority ranges. This is going to create planned orders for each planning range for a particular item. For example, if I have 2 sales orders with 10 and 40 as their respective planning priority values, the planning engine is going to create 2 separate planned fulfillment orders instead of just 1 order for the most urgent sales order. Alternatively, single supply with most important priority, the planning engine will create 1 planned order for the most urgent demand on an item. As you can imagine, this has the potential to ignore less urgent demand. So I prefer this one. Priority calculation method. Currently, we're using priority ranges, as you can see down here. If we wanted to, though, we could base our priorities just on the percent of on hand as it is related to the maximum inventory quantity that we saw earlier on our item coverage page. A little less control there. You're giving over quite a bit to the system in order to make that judgment of what's a priority or not, but might be useful. Today, though, I'm going to be showing the priority ranges because I think it's quite a bit more dynamic. So here, as we create each of these lines, we can add a description in here, and then from quantity to quantity and percent of to quantity. We'll make one of these here in a second, which is going to make a little more sense. But just in order to read this here, we're saying the lowest planning priority, which means the most urgent planning priority item, from quantity 0 or less to quantity 0, with a percent of the to quantity, meaning this field here at 100%, that has our highest planning priority value, essentially just saying, hey, we have none in stock. And then the from quantity on the next line is just taking the to quantity field from the previous line. So now we're saying from quantity of 0 to quantity minimum inventory quantity, but 20% of minimum inventory quantity. And so what we're looking at instead is a range from 0 to 20% of our minimum that we saw earlier in our item on our item coverage group page, on our item coverage page. Our next planning priority value going up from there is just taking the to quantity from our previous line. And so automatically it's populating the from quantity here as 20% of minimum inventory quantity to that reorder point. 100% of it is going to be a planning priority value of 30, and so on and so forth from there. Okay. But what does it look like when we actually create this? So let's try this. Let's type in demo. We're using priority ranges, single supply with most important. We can turn on consider demand just for fun. And then as I select add, the system's automatically going to take me through those different ranges. Okay. So for example, 0 or less to, and I can choose minimum, reorder, maximum, or infinite. Okay. So this is a really handy, smart page in my opinion. For example, if I want to just choose minimum inventory quantity, okay, I can say 50%, select add, and now the next from quantity automatically created as 50% of minimum inventory quantity with a to quantity of the reorder point. Let's say I want that at 80% of reorder point. Now the next one that I add automatically has 80% of reorder point to the maximum inventory quantity. If I just select add again, I don't do anything. Then it's going to take that 100% of maximum inventory quantity, and the next item is going to, of course, have to be 2, quantity of infinite. And there I have my planning priority set up. So I can modify these as needed to create as many lines as possible for different planning priorities to have. So after I've created that, I then need to apply it to my coverage group. I can do so by going over to master planning, setup, coverage groups. All right. And here, for example, in our default, I have this little field here, planning priority model. Select that dropdown, and here I have all those planning priorities models that we just saw. Okay. I take my coverage group, I assign it to my released product, run against it, and there we go. So what would I see as an output perhaps? Well, I can't run it as said, but what I'll end up having is planned orders populated in order to bring me back to that maximum, and in this planning priority field, a priority value associated to it based on the ranges that we saw earlier. So as we saw earlier, it was either 10, 20, 30, or 40 values. I would have those values placed in here depending on the on-hand quantity for those different items associated with my planned orders. All right, last one here, but a big one. The coverage code decoupling point. Now the decoupling point takes into consideration the priority coverage code in terms of using a minimum, reorder point, and maximum, and allocating a priority to planned orders that come out of there. But it's also taken into account the average daily usage, lead times, and of course decoupling points on particular raw materials that are telling the system, hey, we plan on having this raw material on hand at all times as a buffering warehouse. But to talk a little bit about the purpose of the decoupling point, it's essentially to shorten the supply chain vulnerability by maintaining a reasonable amount of on-hand inventory for raw materials that have a significant lead time. That's the trick there. Essentially creating a buffering warehouse. Such items are designated as decoupling points, and when successfully implemented, the production lead time for a finished good with offshore sourced raw materials can reduce drastically because we're no longer having to factor in to our effective production lead time the time it takes to get something from overseas, let's say a semiconductor from Taiwan, for example. So moving on, I want to add that as part of this decoupling point demonstration, I've added lead times to some of the raw materials and used a subcomponent to see how that decoupling point can filter up to a parent level item. Some of the reasons why you might use the decoupling point is if you have, of course, a volatile supply chain, but also raw materials that are used in multiple finished goods or bottleneck operations that will cause serious issues if they're out of stock. Also, items that require a short production lead time, something you really got to get out the door on time. Let's head over now to the coverage group so we can start from the top and check out some applicable fields to our DDMRP that we have to have configured correctly for this to work first. So currently you can see that we have the coverage group on our item coverage for our finished good, as well as the coverage code decoupling point. So let's just jump into our coverage group in order to see those special fields. It's worth noting that once you apply the coverage code decoupling point to the coverage group, you're not getting rid of it. It can change. And so if you're just playing around with your coverage groups and you select decoupling point and save it, you're stuck with it. You'll have to create a new coverage group if you don't want to use decoupling point. But the first field that we have to look at is going to be the lead time factor. And so a lot of these DDMRP parameters are going to be in the other tab. Coming down here to DDMRP parameters, we have the lead time factor. Now, the lead time factor helps determine the quantity and frequency of reorders. Essentially, the lead time factor is a multiplier on our min and max reorder points. The lower the lead time factor, the lower our min and max, resulting in more frequent and smaller orders. In order to avoid a bullwhip reaction, we use 3 different ranges depending on component criticality. And for those who don't know, a bullwhip reaction is essentially a single delayed component that can produce a domino effect of delays for a finished good due to over ordering, inventory swings, and misaligned forecasting, and all that fun stuff that results from an issue. The recommended ranges by the Demand Driven Institute for our lead time variability here, our lead time factor, is going to be based on our longest and shortest lead times. And the ranges for that factor are from 0.2 to 0.40, 0.41 to 0.60, and 0.61 to 1. Those are the recommended ranges for essentially low to high when it comes to our lead time factor. Here, just for demo purposes, I'm going to leave them as 1. The variability factor right below it here, this is going to help determine our minimum stock level. Essentially, the lower our variability factor is, the lower our minimum will be. For more variable items that might stay on the shelf for a while and then suddenly be consumed at a great rate, we can increase the variability factor to raise the minimum stock threshold and provide that buffer. Again, we can use those ranges 0.2 to 0.4, 0.41 to 0.60, and 0.61 to 1. Min, max, and reorder point period field, right down here. This tells DDMRP when to recalculate item buffer quantities based on our chosen parameters. Our item buffer quantities are going to feed into those planned orders that we're going to be creating. And so essentially, in order to determine the quantities for those planned orders, we need to tell, we need to tell DDMRP how often on what data period we want that to be calculated. And so we have 2 options here, daily or weekly. We have the average daily usage based on, and 3 options, past, forward, and blended. Essentially, DDMRP needs to know the time horizon for calculating inventory data to use in its calculations. That's where the ADU comes in. The average daily usage can focus on an item's past data, future demand in the form of future orders and forecasts, or a blending of both. If we choose blended, we also need to tell DDMRP how much to focus on, either the past or future, which is where the relative weight fields come in. Right here, we can see that relative weight of past period for blended average daily usage and forward period for blended daily average usage. And you can see when I select blended, I have those available to me, as well as the forecast model for that forward look. Or if I just choose forward, I only see the forward period in days in the forecast model. Or if I choose past, I'm just looking at that past data. That means real orders, real consumption that is occurring. And consumption can range from production orders, disposals, journal adjustments, like through the inventory adjustment journal, whatever's going to be consumed. Any kind of consumption in the system that's going to feed into our ADU. Okay. And real quick, if you are interested, I'm popping up here on screen the calculation. There's a few different equations to think about when it comes to DDMRP, and this is one of them. The blended ADU is pretty simple. It's just taking that past ADU times its weighting over here, forward ADU times its weighting, and then divided by the sum total of the past and forward weighting. Okay. So we can pop back over to our item coverage now and take a look at our decoupled lead time. Because remember, that's kind of the beginning of figuring out how to plan correctly with DDMRP. We need to establish what is a decoupled point by assigning the decoupled point coverage code. And then, based on the lead times that we have, calculate with the system what the true decoupled lead time is going to be for our produced item after we tell the system, hey, this raw material over here, that's going to be decoupled. Don't worry about its lead time. So clicking on back here, we can come up to our decoupled lead time. All right. And so what I've done here is I have our regular make item, P1004. It has another raw material item right below it. And then also a sub-BOM, okay? And that sub-BOM has 3 raw materials. One of those raw materials is a decoupling point. I also have our finished goods set as a decoupling point just for demonstrative purposes, which I'll get into later so we can do calculations there. But here we have a classic decoupling point that would be used on a raw material. We can see that the lead time here on it is 25. Ouch. We want to avoid that if possible. And so we're claiming that as our decoupling point. We're going to have that on hand at all times, hopefully, when we're producing. But when it comes to these shorter lead times, 4 days, 10 days, okay, 6 days, we don't care. That's all right. But you'll notice that right here, that sub-BOM, that sub-finished good, is going to have its decoupled lead time as 10 instead of 25. Typically, what the system is doing is it's looking at all of the sub-materials and choosing the highest number that is not a decoupling point, and then claiming that as the decoupled lead time for the make item. And so here it's looking at 25, 4, and 10. It knows 25 is decoupled, so we're ignoring that. And the highest between 4 and 10 is, of course, 10. So that becomes our decoupled lead time. Our parent level finished good then looks at its single raw material of 6 lead time, and then its sub-BOM lead time of 10. 10 is bigger than 6, so it chooses 10 as its own decoupled lead time. We can calculate this out by selecting calculate the decoupled lead time in the action pane. This is particularly useful if you have a really complex BOM. I've worked in some companies where they have to use their BOM designers in order to really get the BOM design function here in D365 in order to really get their head around what they're making, because they might have 10 different sub-BOMs. And so having the system calculate all of these different decoupled lead times for you is a big help. And so we can determine the date and quantity associated with our storage dimension in order to help choose a BOM, or we can select it from our drop down here and then select OK. And I've already done that, so we're not going to see any changes here right now. But bear in mind, you can manually change the decoupled lead times. Let's say, for example, on this one here, I want to change that to 8. We can do that. We can refresh here the page, and we're going to see that 8 reflected. You know, I can make this 8, perhaps 12 if I wanted. Refresh again. All right. And when I calculate again, we can see that filter back up to the main item. But really, we should be relying on our lead times in this field here that's coming from those, could be default order settings, could be safety margins, could be a couple of different places that are filtering up in order to give the lead time for this particular item. All right. And so again, the decoupled lead times are calculated by choosing the longest lead time for a non-decoupled component. And the field lead time here is going to be that lead time for the specific item, for example, coming from the default order settings. All right. Great. So we've developed our decoupled lead time. Let's go back and take a look at our average daily usage. And so that average daily usage field is right down here. That's connected to those parameters that we saw on the coverage group. I can turn this to 0, for example, and then select calculate average daily usage. And it's going to use those parameters that we just set on the coverage group in order to calculate that average daily usage. I select it and it's telling me that on average, I use 1 a day. Okay. And so DDMRP needs to have an idea of how often this item is being essentially removed from the inventory. And that's what the ADU is doing for us. When it comes to the calculate min, max, and reorder point quantities, we have our decoupled lead times, our ADU, and now we can manually or automatically configure our finished goods items, our finished goods minimum, reorder point, and maximum. We can toggle these and change these manually if need be, or we can use that ADU and we can use our decoupled lead time in order to calculate them for us. So let's see what it does. Okay. So based on the decoupled lead time, the average daily usage, and different factors that we have set up in our parameters, it's developed minimum, reorder, and maximum quantities of 20, 30, and 40 respectively. And so now that we know, now that we've input the parameters and data necessary in order to calculate these in the future, we can set up DDMRP to recalculate these values on a regular basis. We can also enter an order spike threshold, which is going to tell the system, hey, if, for example, we consume over a particular amount in a given day, the system's going to take the excess, let's say over 30, and factor that amount of demand back into this calculation in order to give us a better minimum, reorder, and maximum quantity. That then feeds into the planned orders that are generated with a priority on top of them. Okay, so that's a lot, but let me just point out real quick the workspace that we can use along with this. So if we go over here to our modules, master planning, and demand-driven MRP. Okay, as mentioned, I'm running this locally, so I don't have access to PLOP, planning optimization. But if I did, I could run this and use this dashboard here, which is going to show orders that are below that minimum, between min and reorder, above reorder, what's considered critically low, on hand low, so on and so forth. So it's breaking down all those different ranges for me. And like what we saw on the other master planning workspace, we can also see a lot of our various fields here. We'll have our numbers still available to us to click into the planned order, as well as its referenced item, the requirement quantity. Okay, and so what's really going on here, as well as that planning priority, very importantly over there. So what's really going on here is we're creating planned orders based on consumption, not necessarily based on demand. So we're not necessarily tracing directly to specific demand, such as a sales order, but we are taking all of that demand and indirectly using it in order to calculate minimums, maximums, and reorder points based on a modified lead time for an item. Okay. And so it's actually quite advanced. We're taking into consideration the imperfect world that we live in when it comes to supply chain management, not being able to always get everything in on time, but still having enough when we need it in order to get our production orders fulfilled on time. At the same time, not having too much in the warehouse. So it's pretty cool. It's a great system, and you can learn more at the DDMRP Institute, DemandDrivenInstitute.com. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again in the future for one of our production order videos that's going to dovetail with this one. Thank you. Bye-bye.